In this part, I'm going to look at the history of apocalyptic interpretation, and I intend to address the claim made by some, including preterists, that historicism was invented by or came through the Roman Catholic Church. Specifically, it is said that historicism came through the Roman Catholic theologian Joachim of Fiore, otherwise known as Joachim Abbas. To address this matter fully, one has to study the history of apocalyptic interpretation, and this would take far too many hours for me to address here, so I'm only going to briefly look at the matter with a view to demonstrating that the origins of what came to be called historicism starts back with the early church fathers. For all the details on the history of apocalyptic interpretation, I recommend reading these books, Romanism and the Reformation and History Unveiling Prophecy, both of those by Grattan Guinness, as well as Eliot's Horae Apocalypticae, Volume 3 and Volume 4. These books have large sections devoted to this topic. Now, who is this man Joachim that I've just referred to? Joachim was an Italian theologian born about 1135 and died about 1202, and he was the founder of the monastic order of San Giovanni in Fiore. According to theologian Bernard McGinn, Joachim of Fiore is the most important apocalyptic thinker of the whole medieval period. In the Horae Apocalypticae, Eliot says this: Joachim Abbas, this is the same man, was a person of greater repute and greater influence as an expounder of prophecy than any other whatever in the Middle Age. Eliot mentions that in the prologue of Joachim's work, he takes care prominently to state that he had not entered into the work presumptuously and merely from his own judgment, but by the authority and at the command of the Roman See. From all that is written about him, I can see that there is no doubt whatsoever that Joachim was a very smart, reputable, and devout student of the Word of God, and so I'm not about to impinge on his ability whatsoever. That being said, he was also a devout Roman Catholic, and the work he undertook in studying the Apocalypse was with the blessing of the Pope. And so you can imagine in this environment he could only go so far with his discoveries and views concerning this book, because he was in a system that he wanted to stay within, that he had to operate within. And this is always the way. If you want to go further into understanding of the Word of God, you will often be hindered by the creed and the boundaries of the church to which you belong. Be that as it may, it is clear that he was a very influential person, and in the Horae Apocalypticae, Eliot includes a considerable amount of commentary concerning his work. Joachim expected the prophecies in the Apocalypse to be fulfilled in the history in which the church was involved, and he attempted the first full historicist approach to explaining the meaning of the Apocalypse, lining up the various prophecies with different historical events. He was the first to apply the day-year principle to the much longer periods that appeared in the Revelation, like the 1260 days. He also believed that the harlot city reigning over the kings of the earth undoubtedly meant Rome, and that the false prophet foretold in the Apocalypse would probably issue out of the bosom of the church. Now, coming to this conclusion, you can imagine how that could have sat with the Pope of the day had not Joachim couched his commentary very strategically, and you can read about this in the Horae Apocalypticae, and you'll see how that E.B. Eliot is somewhat amused by all of this. However, does all of this qualify Joachim to be the originator of historicism? In the first instance, I will say that Joachim had not undertaken his work to protect the papacy. He had undertaken it with the Pope's blessing, but his purpose was not to protect the papacy, and this is in stark contrast with both Ribera and Alcazar, whose sole purpose was to take the heat of the papacy following the outbreak of the Reformation, and so they introduced their futurist and preterist doctrines. Next, we need to understand that Joachim did not come up with his views in a vacuum. As we shall shortly go on and see, there was already a foundation laid much earlier. there was a very long and well-developed history of apocalyptic interpretation to which Joachim added his views. Now, I'll speak more about Joachim shortly, but for now I want to get back to this claim that historicism has come to us through the Roman Catholic Church. Those that make such a claim do not understand what historicism is, and on this I will remind you of what the well-known futurist Clarence Larkin said concerning historicism. We read this much earlier in this series of presentations. Larkin says, the historical school interprets the apocalypse as a series of prophecies predicting the events that were to happen in the world and in the church from John's day to the end of time. It was a powerful and formidable weapon in the hands of the leaders of the Reformation, and the conviction of its truthfulness nerved them to love not their lives unto the death. It was the secret of the martyr heroism of the 16th century. Now let's consider this in light of what Jesus said. Every kingdom divided against itself is brought to desolation, and every city or house divided against itself shall not stand. And if Satan cast out Satan, he is divided against himself. How shall then his kingdom stand? It obviously makes no sense whatsoever that the Church of Rome would develop theology which would be totally opposed to it and used to destroy it. It doesn't work that way, for the children of this world are in their generation wiser than the children of light. Satan does not go about trying to destroy his own kingdom. What does make sense, and what the record shows, is that the Roman Catholic Church came up with both preterism and futurism as schools of eschatology to combat historicism. These two doctrines of devils were singularly designed to take the blowtorch off the papacy by directing it either back to Nero and the first century or onto a future coming Antichrist. The persecutor of God's church did everything it could with a counter-reformation by using violent oppression and persecution and through the muddying of the theological waters to protect and defend its position. Historicism simply did not originate as Roman Catholic doctrine. First of all, when looking into the history of apocalyptic interpretation, the following is obvious, and this is pointed out by Eliot in the Horae Apocalypticae. He says, and it is, I believe, the fact that for the first 4 centuries, the days of Antichrist's duration given in Daniel and the apocalyptic prophecies were interpreted literally as days and not years by the fathers of the Christian church. Now, firstly, the early church fathers were not looking back to the 1st century, but were looking forward in time for the fulfillment of the apocalyptic visions. In terms of the prophetic time measures, for historicists, this early understanding of the prophetic time measures in Daniel and the Revelation as days and not years is in keeping with the things that I've said earlier concerning the mystical and symbolic nature of prophetic time measures. These time measures, and indeed most of the book of Revelation, could not be understood until the passage of a considerable period of time had elapsed and many of the events spoken of had come to pass. Those who lived early in the piece, in the opening of these great prophetic eras, could not properly perceive the true meaning of the details. Sufficient time had to pass, and history had to develop in order to start to get an understanding of what God had previously decreed would be so. That being said, the day for a year principle was already starting to spring forth early in the piece, as we shall see. Additionally, there was a general expectation among the early church that the Roman Empire would be divided into 10 kingdoms as a sign that was to occur before Antichrist would appear. So while they did not properly understand the 1260 days signifying years, they did have an understanding of the basic sequence of events. The point of this, however, is to show the prevailing and continuous understanding of Rome as Babylon down through the Christian age, in contrast with the preterist view that Babylon is Jerusalem. Eliot writes in the History of Apocalyptic Volume 3 this: Augustine, though not differing from his predecessors in the expectation of a personal Antichrist, and I just want to stop here and point out that the early church fathers expected that Antichrist would be an individual who would hold sway for 3.5 years. Now, being so early in the piece, they could not possibly appreciate that Antichrist would be a position, a seat, an entire dynasty of kings that would reign supreme for 1,260 years. How could they? It was veiled in the symbolic language of the Revelation, and the light of understanding did not begin to shine on men's hearts and minds until much later. But we'll go on. Though not differing from his predecessors in the expectation of a personal Antichrist destined to continue in power for 3.5 years, he expounded it to symbolize the whole body of unbelievers, whether in open profession or in heart, who, under the guidance of many antichrists or anti-Christian teachers, constituted that impious state and kingdom which ever has been and ever will be opposed to Christ's people and kingdom in this world, that which in his time had already lasted nearly 400 years, reckoned from the time of Christ's ministry and death, and would comprehend also, as he expounded, within its period of duration, all that remained of time to the world's end. This, his view of the apocalyptic beast, was perpetuated in after ages, and chiefly by those who followed him as their master. Thus, Tychonius, or else his interpolator in the 5th century, in one passage repeats, unless indeed it was the original of, Augustine's exposition of the beast. In another expounds the 1,260 days to signify the whole period from Christ's sufferings to the end of the world. So we can see that back early in the piece, while it was believed that the 1,260 days were 3.5 years, the idea was also developing that it may well also signify a much greater period of time. With this foundation laid, much later, it was Joachim who advanced the idea that the 1,260 days in the Apocalypse and in Daniel were in fact intended to be understood as years, and he was right. Joachim, then living in the 12th century AD, was at that important point in time when men could begin to properly appreciate the massive scale of the prophecy. Eliot continues, again, Primasius, an Augustinian of the 6th century, explains the 42 months, 1,260 days, and times and half a time as specially designating the time of Antichrist's last persecution, yet generally signifying also the whole time of the duration of the church. Eliot continues, and moreover, very remarkably, though they did not in regard of this particular period suggest the mystical meaning that we argue for, and applied to the 1,260 days, the year-day scale of enlargement, yet with regard to another smaller apocalyptic period, the 3.5 days of Revelation 11 verse 8, they did nearly all, and after them sundry others also, both apply and argue for it, alike Tychonius and his near contemporary Prosper, Primasius and Ambrose Ansbert, Hamo, Berengord and Bruno of Asti. See the citations below, and I haven't included the citations because they're nearly all in Latin, and as you probably realize, I've really struggled throughout this entire series of presentations to say these names and words correctly, and it would be a bridge too far for me to read out these Latin citations, but they're available for you to go and read in the History of Apocalyptic. The interesting point, however, is that the day-year principle was widely applied to the 3.5 days in Revelation 11. So once again, the foundation was already laid for others to come later and point out that this same principle should also be applied to the much longer time measurements appearing in the same book. One sows the seed, another waters, and God gives the increase. I'm cutting a lot out here, but Eliot continues. Cyprian and his biographer Pontius apparently in the 3rd century, and Theodoret unquestionably about the middle of the 5th century, adopted and applied the year-day principle to quite other prophetic periods. The former, in reference to a day's respite of Cyprian's martyrdom, promised to the saint in vision which he interpreted, rightly interpreted as the event proved, to signify a year. The latter, one of the most learned of all the Greek fathers, with reference to Daniel's prophecy of the 70 hebdomads on the year-day principle, explains them to signify hebdomads of years, meaning the 490 years. Now, a hebdomad simply means a group of 7. Then, following on from all of this, we come to Joachim, and Eliot says, I have only to add that the famous Joachim Abbas, near the close of the 12th century, in his apocalyptic comment, applies the principle to another apocalyptic period, viz., that predicated on the scorpion locusts, explaining their 150 days to mean very possibly 150 years. Also, the 42 months of the witnesses prophesying in sackcloth he explains as so many generations, which on his defined scale of 30 years to a generation makes 1,260 years, answering to the symbolic witnesses 1,260 days, a calculation evidently applied by him also to the 1,260 days of the woman's wilderness sojourning and the beast's 1,260 days of power. And so Eliot concludes that part by saying, thus, instead of the novelty of the year-day principle, from Cyprian's time, nearly the middle of the 3rd century, even to the times of Joachim and the Waldenses in the 12th century, there was kept up by a succession of expositors in the Church a recognition of the precise year-day principle of interpretation, and its application made, not without consideration and argument, to one and another of the chronological prophetic periods of days, including the shorter one of those that were involved in the prophecies respecting Antichrist, though not so far to that of the 1,260 predicted days of Antichrist's duration. What I see that is quite interesting in all of this is not only that Joachim built on a foundation of understanding that had already been laid by many others, but the proper understanding of the 1,260 days as years did not come about until about that much time had run its course, for Joachim lived almost 1,200 years after the prophecy had been given, and he was now at that point in time when men were able to grasp the larger scope of the prophecy. The days are to be understood as years in all of the prophetic time measures in the Revelation and in the book of Daniel. In Grattan Guinness's book Romanism and the Reformation, under Lecture 5, he discusses the pre-Reformation interpreters in quite some detail, if you care to take a look at this. He breaks this down into 3 main parts. Firstly, the period extending from the apostolic times to the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century. Secondly, the period extending from the fall of the Roman Empire and rise of the papacy in the 5th century to its exaltation under the pontificate of Gregory VII, or Hildebrand, the founder of the papal theocracy in the 11th century. And thirdly, the period from Gregory VII to the Reformation. Grattan Guinness goes on and says, first then, let us glance at the history of the prophetic interpretation in the interval extending from apostolic times to the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century. This was the period of the so-called Fathers of the Christian Church. A multitude of their writings remain to us, containing not only countless references to the prophecies in question, but complete commentaries on Daniel and the Apocalypse. It is boldly claimed by many that the fathers of the first 5 centuries held the futurist interpretation of these books. We deny the correctness of this position and assert that the fathers of the first 5 centuries belonged to the historical school of interpretation. It was impossible for them, owing to the early position which they occupied, rightly to anticipate the manner and scale of the fulfillment of these wondrous prophecies. but as far as their circumstances permitted, they correctly grasped their general significance and adhered to that interpretation which regards prophecy as foretelling the whole course of the Church's warfare from the first century to the second advent. Grattan Guinness quotes the words of Hippolytus on the great image and four wild beasts, which say this: "The golden head of the image," he says, "is identical with the lioness by which the Babylonians were represented. The shoulders and the arms of silver are the same with the bear, by which the Persians and Medes are meant. The belly and thighs of brass are the leopard, by which the Greeks who ruled from Alexander onwards are intended. The legs of iron are the dreadful and terrible beasts, by which the Romans who hold the empire now are meant. The toes of clay and iron are the 10 horns which are to be. The one other little horn springing up in their midst is the Antichrist. The stone that smites the image and breaks it in pieces, and that filled the whole earth, is Christ, who comes from heaven and brings judgment on the world." Hippolytus's words are clearly not preteristic, nor are they futuristic, as though Antichrist would come in 2,000 years' time during a period of 7 years of great tribulation, but rather he is historical in his approach. The Roman Empire was continuing in his day, but was to transition to 10 horns, and in the midst of these, Antichrist would arise. After all of this, Christ would come in judgment. This is the historicist's approach to these prophecies. Grattan Guinness writes about Irenaeus, who lived 130 to 202 AD, and he says this: Irenaeus, in his book Against Heresies, chapter 26, says, "John in the Apocalypse teaches us what the 10 horns shall be, which were seen by Daniel." And then Grattan Guinness has a footnote on page 119 that says this: Irenaeus held that the division of the Roman Empire into 10 kingdoms would immediately precede the manifestation of Antichrist. And I've cut this quote right down, but Guinness concludes, "Thus, according to Irenaeus, the manifestation of Antichrist required the previous overthrow of the then existing Roman Empire." Once again, Irenaeus is neither preteristic nor futuristic, but takes an historicist's approach to the book of Revelation. He is expecting to see these things take place at some point while the church is still around. Next, we have Origen of Alexandria, who lived about 184 to 253 AD. Now, I've read an article by a preterist who basically claims that Origen was a solid preterist because of the way that he viewed the coming of Jesus in the destruction of Jerusalem. And to me, this is the stuff of nonsense. Just because an earlier writer views a certain aspect of the scriptures as being fulfilled in the 1st century AD does not make them a preterist. If so, historicists would have to be classed along with them, as we take in the past, present, and the future, which includes fulfilled events in the 1st century AD. Now, as far as I understand Origen, he was more given over to extreme allegorizations and symbolism beyond good sense, as E.B. Eliot puts it. But anyway, Grattan Guinness says of Origen, in his famous book Against Heresies, thus expressed himself in Book 6, chapter 46, after quoting nearly the whole of Paul's prophecy about the man of sin in 2 Thessalonians, quote, "Paul speaks of him who is called Antichrist, describing, though with a certain reserve, both the manner and time and cause of his coming. The prophecy also regarding Antichrist is stated in the book of Daniel, and is fitted to make an intelligent and candid reader admire the words as truly divine and prophetic, for in them are mentioned the things relating to the coming kingdom, beginning with the times of Daniel and continuing to the destruction of the world." Once again, this is an historicist's approach to the prophecies. And I'd like to clarify, as I've already alluded to, that Origen was somewhat of a controversial figure in early church history, so you need to be aware of this. And I've already mentioned that he was given over to allegorization and symbolism beyond good sense, as E.B. Eliot had stated. The point that I'm making, however, is that there is a consistency in understanding in early church history that is neither preteristic nor futuristic, but leans in the direction of historicism. Next, we come to Tertullian, who was born about 155 to 160 AD. No, he wasn't born over 4 years. There seems to be some ambiguity on when he was born exactly, and he died about 240 AD. Concerning Tertullian, we read this. In his magnificent apology addressed to the rulers of the Roman Empire, Tertullian says that the Christian Church, not himself, Mark, but the Christian Church prayed for the emperors and for the stability of the Empire of Rome, because they knew, quote, that a mighty shock impending over the whole earth, in fact, the very end of all things, threatening dreadful woes, was only retarded by the continued existence of the Roman Empire, end quote. Now, once again, that is a definite historicist approach to the prophecy. Tertullian's apology thus describes the habit of the Christian Church of the 2nd century to pray for the security of the Roman Empire in the knowledge that its downfall would bring the catastrophe of the reign of Antichrist and the ruin of the world. Addressing the rulers of the Roman Empire, he says, quote, "We offer prayer for the safety of our princes to the eternal, the true, the living God, whose favour, beyond all others, they must themselves desire. There is also another and greater necessity for our offering prayer. In behalf of the emperors, nay, for the complete stability of the empire, and for Roman interests in general. For we know that a mighty shock impending over the whole earth, in fact, the very end of all things, threatening dreadful woes, is only retarded by the continued existence of the Roman Empire. We have no desire then to be overtaken by these dire events, and in praying that their coming may be delayed, we are lending our aid to Rome's duration." End quote. That's taken from Apology, Numbers 30 to 32. It's quite clear as we look at the history of apocalyptic interpretation that this notion that is out there, that historicism was invented by the Roman Catholic Church or comes to us solely through Joachim of Fiore, this notion is wide of the mark and is downright mischievous. It's either stated on the basis of ignorance or it's intended to mislead people who are looking for the truth. In my opinion, it's probably a little of both of these. Next, we come to Augustine, who lived 354 to 430 AD. Concerning this, we read, Augustine says, quote, "Rome, the second Babylon and the daughter of the first, to which it pleased God to subject the whole world and bring it all under one sovereignty, has now founded." End of quote. In chapter 28, he calls Rome, quote, "the Western Babylon," end quote. In chapter 41, he says, quote, "It has not been in vain that this city has received the mysterious name of Babylon, for Babylon is interpreted confusion, as we have said elsewhere." End quote. It is clear from these quotations that Augustine did not interpret the Babylon of the Apocalypse as meaning either the literal Babylon on the Euphrates, as some of the futurists have done, nor Jerusalem as the preterists do, but rather Babylon designates Rome. And this is still the interpretation of the historic school, and as events have developed, this has shown that not only was Babylon Rome, but Rome in its papal form. Grattan Guinness writes in his book Key to the Apocalypse, "The view that the Babylon of the Apocalypse represents Rome has prevailed in the Christian Church, both Eastern and Western, from the earliest of times." And then Grattan Guinness cites Hippolytus, Victorinus, Augustine, Protestant interpreters, and also Roman Catholic interpreters. Concerning the Roman Catholic writers, Guinness cites Cardinal Bellarmine, who says, "Rome is signified in the Apocalypse by the name of Babylon." Also, Cardinal Baronius, who says, "All persons confess that Rome is denoted by the name Babylon in the Apocalypse of John." Also, Bossuet declares that the features are so marked that it is easy to decipher Rome under the figure of Babylon. Now, we need to note that the principal difference between the Roman Catholic and the Protestant writers is this. The Roman Catholics point only to pagan Rome as being Babylon, whereas the Protestants point to both pagan and papal Rome, with papal Rome in particular representing the Babylon of the Apocalypse. I will take a break here dealing with this segment on the history of apocalyptic interpretation and continue in the next part.